Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily for Wednesday, July 10th, 2019. On today's episode, we're going to talk about the latest film and TV news. And in the mailbag, we'll be answering some questions in response to the Spider-Man Far From Home spoiler discussion. This is Slash Film Editor-in-Chief Peter Scirettais. And joining me on today's podcast is Slash Film Managing Editor Jacob Halland.
Hello, hello.
And writer Chris Evangelistato.
Hello, folks.
Okay, let's dive into it. We have a bunch of news to get to because we've had that spoiler discussion yesterday. So something that hit was we learned a bit more about this Warner Brothers streaming service. Chris, what do we know?
It is now called HBO Max. That's the official name. It's going to have, obviously, the HBO content. It's going to have...
Does it have a bigger screen?
I don't know about that. It's going to have HBO content. It's going to have Cinemax content. It's going to have pretty much everything having to do with Warner Brothers. It's also going to be the official streaming home of Friends, which I know will upset lots of people who watch it repeatedly on Netflix. So instead of watching it on Netflix, you're going to have to watch it on HBO Max now. Sorry, everyone.
What are they going to have? I mean, okay, so they have all the HBO or they have all the Warner Brothers content over the air. Like, what does that include other than like Friends?
A lot of the CW DC shows will be on there, like Batwoman, the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, I guess, which is owned by them, is going to be on there too. There's also films from New Line Cinema, stuff from DC Entertainment, on and on. There's also
New Line Cinema, that's a lot of horror for you.
Yeah, I don't know if I'll be subscribing, but yes. There's also going to be original stuff that Dune show, which is going to be tying into the big Dune movie that's being made. So there's going to be a lot of stuff on here. Whether or not people actually want to watch it is another story.
What other original content? Because, there was that Gremlins animated prequel series we talked about. The Dune show. Is there anything else exciting in terms of original content?
No. There's a list. You can read it on slashfilm.com, but none of this other than the Dune show really appeals to me, honestly.
And right now we don't know a price point for this?
I don't believe so. No, not yet.
Okay, so firstly, I want to ask you, what do you think of the name HBO Max? Because HBO... I always kind of separate. I know it's owned by Warner, but I always kept it separate. It's kind of to me, a more adult brand, even though I know they do some kids programming during the day. Does this fit all of Warner Media?
I don't think so. It just makes it sound literally just like another HBO streaming service, which I guess it kind of is, but it's kind of weird to me that they kept the HBO name.
Jacob, what do you think about it? Are you going to subscribe to this?
As someone who subscribes to HBO Now already, if Warner can put together a package deal or a fair price that says, hey, replace HBO Now or upgrade for a few bucks more for a lot more content, I think I'm already in. It is a question if they want me to pay another $15 a month or just roll it together in a way that is satisfying. And while the HBO Max name is weird, I do think trying to introduce a brand new name in the age where we already have Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, and all their names would be a mistake. So even though it could sound like, just an expansion on the existing HBO streaming services, at least HBO is a service people already regularly use. So it could be something that people are more willing to pay up for than if it was just called Warney or something. I don't know.
But why not take advantage of the Warner Brothers brand name? That's been around for over 100 years or something.
I think people would roll their eyes at that, though. I think people would say oh, I've seen the Warner Bros. Logo before movies on Netflix. Why should I pay for this? Whereas people already are accustomed to paying for HBO to stream it. So I think it's just a matter of trying to get in on an already established streaming brand as opposed to building from the ground up. Because I know we get nostalgic and excited when we see the Warner Bros. Crest, Peter, but I don't think regular people do.
Yeah, I think you're sadly right. And I'm just kind of disappointed by all these streaming company names, like the Pluses and Maxes. It all sounds like, I made the joke about the larger screen, but it really sounds like, name versions of smartphones. It doesn't sound like something I want, a channel or a streaming service I want to subscribe to. Not that I'm not going to, because I'm obviously going to, because I do this for a living. I have to subscribe to all the channels. So,
well, is it too late for us to announce Slash Film Max Plus, the new video website that we are going to be streaming in 2027?
Jacob, you've spoiled this. I cannot edit this out of the podcast, so unfortunately, it's going to have to. I guess people are going to have to speculate on that. So okay, let's move from HBO to Amazon. They're doing that new Lord of the Rings series, and apparently, alongside that, they're going to be developing an MMO video game.
Yeah, this came from The Verge today. Amazon's teaming up with Liu in the game studio Athlon to make a Lord of the Rings MMO, or a massively multiplayer online game. If that sounds familiar, it's because World of Warcraft made this really famous in the early 2000s, even though it's not the first MMO. And the basic gist is you go online, you build a character, and you go adventuring in a giant world full of quests, and you do it with friends online. You build teams, you kill monsters, you level up, you collect items. It's all very addictive, and when done well, it's all very fun. Interestingly, there already exists Lord of the Rings Online. It's been around for more than a decade. But interest in MMOs has waned in the past 10 years or so. World of Warcraft is still popular, but the days of these massive fantasy MMOs like reigning and being king are they're a thing of the past. They're now a niche kind of game instead of a all-domineering force. So it's really odd for Amazon, who has very little experience, to be making a Lord of the Rings game, let alone an MMO, and especially one they claim is not related to the series, although both the game and the upcoming TV show are both prequels. So the question is, which one is set at which period in Middle-earth's history, since we know the show is set during the Second Age, which is a couple thousand years before the original trilogy. So my big question is, why would Amazon invest all this money in a Lord of the Rings video game unless they want to tie it into the $1 billion TV show they've already lined up? Peter, am I missing something here?
I think that sounds about right. Like, I'm guessing when they acquired the rights for this Lord of the Rings TV series, it also included the rights to make some kind of online game, because I'm guessing there's probably some wording. I could be completely wrong here, but I'm just speculating that there's some wording that they're getting the rights to any kind of Lord of the Rings content that is streaming, online engagement, like there's something like that. And because they have that, they're gonna obviously try to make some money, because they spent how much on the Lord of the Rings license? It was a lot of money, right?
Yeah, it was a lot. I know the number being tossed around in terms of buying the rights and developing the show and getting production budget together was $1 billion. So they've already invested that many figures into this. So why not toss in a couple $100 million more at that point?
I just don't know how you're going to compete with people like Blizzard and companies that have, are doing this for decades. It just seems nuts to me, and I know there's big Lord of the Rings fans, but I feel like there's no way they're going to be able to outdo those companies in the space.
I mean, people love Lord of the Rings, and there's been a lot of Lord of the Rings video games, but I just feel like unless you're World of Warcraft, MMOs aren't on fire right now. They're not the game of choice. It feels like a really weird investment to make at this point in video game history.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to Look Who's Talking. They're rebooting this for some reason. I think it's probably all these talking dog movies. Chris, what is going on here?
So Sony Pictures is rebooting Look Who's Talking, which is, of course, the 80s film where Bruce Willis's voice comes out of a baby. And they made 3 of these movies. There's Look Who's Talking 2, which had Roseanne as the voice of the sister.
That's TOO?
Yes, because, it's cute that way. And then there's Look Who's Talking Now, which had talking dogs. And none of these movies are very good. I don't think anyone wants a reboot of any of this, but it's going to happen anyway, because of course it is. Why would Hollywood ever do anything original or clever or exciting ever again when they could just reboot Look Who's Talking?
Okay. On that note, I saw The Lion King last night. A bad transition, or maybe it's an awesome transition.
No, it's an apt transition. Yeah, it's perfect.
We published an early Buzz article rounding out all the reactions from social media. I will tell you what I thought of it. I think it's a breathtaking visual cinematic achievement. I can't believe this is a CG animated movie. Timon and Pumbaa, I think, steal the show. It's a good Disney remake, but is it really necessary? Probably not, but I think families are going to love it. I will say, I go to a bunch of these like world premieres and stuff, and the audience is usually pumped and people are clapping and whatever. But this seemed to be more than usual. It seemed like the audience was more into it than normal. I think it's going to play big, really, with families. I thought it was fine. Like, I think the animated version is better, although I think this is, it's very interesting because it's weird because they're, these talking animals, but they're not, cartoon design, it's not, they don't have the exaggerated features and exaggerated animation of the original Lion King. So it feels, something about it feels off. But artistically, I think it's probably the best version of this that could be possibly made. Ben also saw this last night. He said, quote, "Better than I thought it would be. I still really miss the exaggerated emotions of the characters from the original, but you get occasional flashes of this, and the vocal performances are largely good enough to make up for the rest." And he also says Timon and Pumbaa steal the show. Jermaine Lucier, who used to write for the site, tweeted, The Lion King is a wonderful adaptation of an iconic classic. It has a few small changes which enhance what was already great, and everything else is right on point. The CG can be slightly distracting at times, but the emotion quickly covers up for it. Loved it. So it seems like, you can read all the reactions here, it seems like most people liked or loved this new movie. I think it's gonna do really well. Again, is it necessary? Probably not, but it's, I don't know, like, Jacob, am I wrong? Like what could be, like, I am saying that this is the best possible version of, a quote unquote realistic, if not live action remake of this property, but like, I guess it loses some of that charm of that 2D animation, but at the same time, I've talked to many, like, young people these days, like, family relatives and stuff like that. They do not like watching 2D animated stuff, which is sad. So maybe this will get them to get excited about Lion King and go back to that animated classic?
Man, I hope so. I mean, that's a similar thing with my nieces and nephews. My mom watches them every day while their parents are at work, and talk about how she'll bring on Netflix, and they won't even for a moment pay attention to older Disney movies, but you put on Coco or Cars 3, and they're immediately drawn to it. So I think we're reaching the time when traditional animation becomes niche, and it becomes something that aficionados and adults can enjoy, and it makes me very sad. It makes me tremendously, powerfully sad.
Yeah. What's sad? I was talking to some critics at the after party of this premiere, and we were talking about how Disney's kind of running out of properties to adapt into live action movies, and not running out, but running out of like the older ones. And I was like, we were speculating like, eventually they're gonna have to get to like Moana and Frozen, but they probably have to wait a few years for that. So then we were like, will they actually adapt The Princess and the Frog, like an animated movie that I guess was not considered a hit, so much so that they abandoned hand-drawn animation? Do you think that will ever happen?
Not until they adapt Home on the Range first, Peter, and get some CGI octogenarian cows in realistic live-action CG.
I don't think we need that.
Oh, I do. What I want to see, Peter, is a Disney live-action machine to crash and burn just like traditional Disney live-action did in the early 2000s. They need their Brother Bear live action bomb. They need their Home on the Range live action bomb. Disney live action needs to be humbled, damn it. They need that to happen to them so they can turn around and fix the bad ones.
Well,
Lion King sounds good, but like, we don't need another Beauty and the Beast. We don't need that to happen again. It can't happen to us.
Wait, but wasn't Dumbo that live action bomb?
It was a disappointment. What we need is a Home on the Range level disaster, a movie that literally no one on Earth cares about. Whereas people seem to have nice words for Dumbo here and there. We need a crash and burn, Peter. It needs to happen.
Okay, let's move on to Spider-Man: Far From Home. We learned yesterday that if this movie does not make $1 billion, Sony will break free of the Marvel Studios deal. Jacob, what do we know?
Yeah, this is a very interesting story. It comes from Richard Rushfield in The Ankler, the Hollywood newsletter. And Rushfield's reporting is sometimes cloaked in mystery and gossip because it's a combination of him being a tease and a combination of him protecting his sources. But what he did report is, I'm going to quote him, "The original Sony Marvel Spidey deal to co-produce these movies stipulated that if this Spidey cleared $1 billion, Marvel would get to oversee a third. If it hadn't, full control would have reverted back to Sony." And now, if you may remember, the basic details, it's very complex, I can't wait for the book about this deal to be written, is that Sony still owns Spider-Man. They still distribute these movies. They still make the bulk of the money from them. Marvel is just a creative partner. They oversee storytelling choices and getting the movies made on a creative level, whereas Sony is still footing most of the bill and still reaping most of the rewards. And the deal is that Spider-Man can exist in the MCU and they can benefit from that. Everybody wins. But apparently there was this footnote in there that if the Marvel Studios, steered Spider-Man movies weren't doing well and weren't making $1 billion like traditional Marvel Studios movies do, Sony could snatch it back, which is a scary prospect considering, the Amazing Spider-Man and other decisions being made for the Spider-Man franchise prior to Marvel entering this partnership.
Prior? Right now, you're saying prior? Look at Venom.
You're completely right. Venom is a nightmare. With all due respect to the hardworking people who made Venom, that movie is a studio note writ large, and it does not work at all, at least for me. I know it has its fans. But, Peter...
I think it works for all the wrong reasons, but...
But Far From Home is going to clear $1 billion. At this point, it's made like $700 million in a little over a week. It's going to be fine. We're going to get a third Spider-Man movie for sure at this point, with Marvel overlooking it, unless something goes disastrously, horribly wrong. But Peter, what do you think of this deal in place? What do you think about? Do you think Sony is salivating and waiting for this deal to run out at this point so they can take Tom Holland's universe and run with it, or do you think maybe we see Sony and Marvel sign a new document, keep on working together, and keep benefiting both parties? What happens here?
I don't know. It's interesting because Tom Holland has a contract for 6 movies, and I guess a third Spider-Man film would be the end of that deal. Not that he wouldn't re-sign for more. This is interesting because everybody's been wondering, are they going to make a third Spider-Man movie? And I think even Kevin Feige was asked about it. He was like, that's not a done deal yet or something like that. And now we know why. If this is true that they had hit $1 billion for that to happen. It seems like we'll be getting that in 2 years. So maybe we'll hear about, maybe by the time of next week. Wait, can this movie hit $1 billion by next week? By the end of next week?
It's entirely possible. I think that, especially with international numbers and as more markets open up, it's going to get very close to $1 billion by next week.
Yeah,
I'd say that much.
So maybe at Marvel Studios' presentation at Comic-Con, we could have Feige announcing the date for the third Spider-Man movie, coming 2 years, assuming that, it keeps the same schedule. But I don't know. You're asking after the 3. They've always, I think even when they were promoting Homecoming, they were talking about it as a trilogy of films. And so I don't know. I'm really curious. Does Disney own the live action rights to Miles Morales? And could they introduce Miles Morales in this third film and them go their separate ways in some way? I don't know. It'll be interesting to see, but I think to talk any further about this, we need to go into spoilers. So if you have not seen Spider-Man Far From Home, you can tune out now. We're going to do one more news story, and then we're going to do some questions from the mailbag. But yeah, tune out now. Here we go. Okay, so I guess the question is, where does the Spider-Man story go next? Chris, what does Kevin Feige say about this?
Spider-Man Far From Home, it ends with Spider-Man's identity being revealed to the whole world because Mysterio is a jerk, and he basically gives away Peter Parker's true identity. And on one level, that's sort of very similar to the ending of the first Iron Man, where Tony Stark tells the whole world that he's Iron Man and doesn't have to worry about secret identities anymore. So Kevin Feige said, quote, "Now people know Peter's identity. People now think he's a villain. Mysterio plays one last trick on him and succeeds. So that means everything's different. Where it goes, we'll see. But it's exciting that it once again sets us up for a Peter Parker story that has never been done before on film. So even though I would argue that Spider-Man 2, the Sam Raimi film, people sort of learn Peter Parker is Spider-Man in that train scene where his mask comes off, but I guess no one knows who Peter Parker is technically.
Yeah.
But
they didn't know who that boy was.
Right, but they knew he was just a kid because that's that whole scene where he's like, he's just a kid. Anyway, so that's going to be, I guess, the focus of the third film. For one thing, Peter Parker has to clear his name because Mysterio framed him. And for another thing, everyone will now know Peter Parker is Spider-Man.
The weird thing is when they were promoting Homecoming, I think John Watts, the director, was talking about how they were setting up this trilogy of films to be almost like the Harry Potter films, where each year was going to take place in a year of high school. And I feel like they can't go back to high school after this, right, Jacob?
That's what I've been wondering about, because famously in the Civil War comic arc, not the movie version, Peter Parker does unmask as part of Tony Stark's plan to, make superheroes all government regulated. And at first it goes fine because he's under the protection of Tony Stark, and he moves Aunt May into protective, housing where people can't get to her. And there's a whole stretch of time where Spider-Man was essentially, financed by Tony Stark and financed and protected by the powers that be. But in that comic book arc, he ends up switching sides and loses all of that. And there's a big couple of years where Spider-Man, his identity is known, his family's in danger, he's always in danger, he's on the run. And it's a whole thing. I'm not as familiar with it as with other Spider-Man arcs, but it does exist. It exists to the point where, in probably the most infamous moment in Spider-Man comic book history, Spider-Man makes a literal deal with the devil that resets comic book canon so that everybody forgets who Spider-Man is.
Wow.
And it's a very famously hated storyline.
That sounds almost as bad as the Clone Saga.
Yeah, it's rough. And to Marvel's credit, they used this reboot to get Spider-Man back on track, and some really amazing Spider-Man stories came out after this. Because they were able to sort of reset his relationships and retell them in ways that were actually really satisfying. But the whole duel with the devil thing remains this black smear. And the fact that Marvel Comics, which has a universe of possibilities, found themselves so back to a corner story-wise that they had to literally bring in Satan to fix the unmasking of Spider-Man, makes me really wonder what the plan is here.
Yeah, I'm curious too, especially him saying that it's a story that has never been done before in film. But I mean, that could mean anything. Like, he could be just talking in broad terms, but like, who do you think could be the villain for this third film?
John Watts, the director, recently did an interview where he said his villain of choice would be Kraven the Hunter, who is a big game hunter who is obsessed with hunting down and killing Spider-Man, is like his ultimate trophy. And I think that actually would make a really interesting choice. If Peter Parker is known, he's known as a villain, then a guy who's literally out to hunt down, the biggest prey and sees a massive target everybody hates would make a whole lot of sense for the villain, especially a guy who knows who Peter is and will stop at nothing to literally kill him for sport.
I know a lot of people love that Kraven's Last Hunt arc of the comics. I've never read it, but it's one of the most popular Spider-Man arcs, right?
Yeah, I can't remember the years. I believe it was in the 80s. Kraven was terminally ill and determined at all costs to kill Spider-Man no matter what. So it became like a all-out brawl with Kraven pulling out every last trick in his book to wear Spider-Man down and take him out. A lot of that arc relies on the history of Kraven Spider-Man and him having been a villain since the 60s. But I do think that if they cast the right actor and establish, hey, this guy's an old, weary, supervillain looking for one last big score, one last big job, one last big grab at glory, it could be a really cool way to have Spider-Man go up against, somebody who's the exact opposite, somebody who is, old at the end of his life, trying to take down this youngster.
Yeah, and that arc was published in 1987, and I think, at least the way I read it, Kraven ends up killing Spider-Man, so it's kind of almost like the Superman Doomsday kind of thing, but it turned out that he was just tranquilized for a couple days or something.
Hey, Peter, comic books, right?
How is that going to translate to the big screen, though, Jacob?
Not at all. They will take those loose skeleton bones and build new flesh entirely over it.
Okay, let's answer some questions in the mailbag. We got a bunch of letters from our Spider-Man Far From Home discussion. John O. from New Jersey, which he says is home of the Six Flags Great Adventure, one of the most underrated theme parks in America. I have not been. Jacob or Chris, have you either been to Six Flags Great Adventure?
That's your neck of the woods, Chris.
No, no, I have not.
Okay. Well, if I'm ever there, I'll have to check it out. He says, does anyone else have a problem with watching Euphoria right after seeing Spider-Man Far From Home? I love MJ's character just as much as Peter does and don't want to ruin it.
I've only seen an episode and a half of Euphoria. My wife is getting really into it. But I think that it just proves that Zendaya has quite the range. I'm enjoying the whiplash of her doing a really hardcore, upsetting HBO show while being effortlessly charming on the big screen. But it just makes me appreciate her more as a performer. It doesn't ruin it for me at all, although it is tough to watch.
Okay, let's move on to our next letter from Paul Jolly from Melbourne, Australia. Writes in, he enjoyed the spoiler discussion of Far From Home. I couldn't help noting that when you were guessing potential names for the next Spider-Man movie, surely Homespun should be too good to miss. Jacob, you weren't on for that. I was wondering, do you have any suggestions for name titles for Spider-Man 3? I think I said Spider-Man Home No More, I think was my guess. It has to have home in the title, right?
Yeah, I was thinking Spider-Man Home Alone 2 Lost in New York. Spider-Man must defend his apartment from the Sinister Six by laying out a bunch of traps.
What do we think of Homespun? Is that that feels like not... I don't know. Is Homespun a more international word? I feel like I don't use the word homespun.
Yeah, I think it's an old-fashioned word for sure. My whole thing with the homespun is that it has home in it and it has spun like a web, so it works on a double level. So I'm not sure if I should title it that, but I do appreciate Paul's pun here.
Yeah, it's good. Okay, Brian from Austin writes in that I feel like Peter Parker's arc tracks pretty well throughout the films, and he's in response to me saying that I think Peter Parker's arc has been kind of wishy-washy throughout the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He argues that teenagers certainly are impulsive and may not know what they want in the future, but Peter is more of a victim of the other people influencing him than anything else. The fact that he is compelled to help people, even when it means getting in over his head. So in Civil War, he says he wants to protect the neighborhood. Tony asks him to step up, and he does. Homecoming, Peter has had a taste of being an Avenger and thinks that's what he wants, and then realizes he's not ready and has other priorities. Infinity War has no choice but to join the fight because the threat is so large. His mentor and city are being attacked, and Far From Home still wants to be the neighborhood Spider-Man, tries to leave it behind for his vacation, but has to step it up when Fury recruits him and Tony gives him Edith. You weren't around for this whole discussion. I think you had to leave the podcast, Jacob. What do you think of Peter's arc throughout the MCU thus far?
I don't quite agree with you to the extent that you fell on Peter. I'm a little bit more positive on it. I do think it falls victim to being split across several movies in different corners of a franchise. I mean, each movie has to be true to a movie you maybe did not see. Like, if you didn't see Civil War, you're still going to hopefully enjoy Homecoming. If you didn't see Infinity War, hopefully you'll still enjoy Far From Home. So I do think that it's a bit more scattered than it should be. But I do think Tom Holland holds it together and makes it work by playing up the in over his head, youthfulness of Peter Parker and a guy who is easily influenced and has to learn the hard way. So I think that on a writing level, I do think it's choppy work, despite the design of how this franchise has been built. But I do think that Tom Holland really makes it work against all odds.
I mean, I agree with that. I think I said on the podcast that it reminds me of these like big crossover events in the comics, which, happen out of nowhere and sometimes force these heroes to make choices and their arc change like suddenly. And I feel like that's what happened with Infinity War and Endgame. But I feel like without that, it is a little bit better. I will say this: I was listening to the Slash Filmcast review of Spider-Man Far From Home, and one thing didn't occur to me because I haven't watched Homecoming since it came out is Peter's relationship with MJ at the beginning of this movie. He's like, has this plan to tell her how he feels and everything like that. But at the end of Homecoming, he wasn't even like smitten with her. Like, it was not even like a thing. So it kind of like jumps from 0 to 80. Do we have any problem with that?
No, in 8 months, how can you not fall in love with Zendaya in 8 months? I'm totally fine with that.
Yeah. Okay. John A. writes in, I think you guys are missing the real reason behind the second post-credits scene. This is the one with Nick Fury in space. He says, I think it's a setup for Sword. So that is an interesting take. Who is Sword, Jacob?
Sword is it is the space counterpart to Shield. In the comics, Shield is a group that Nick Fury runs, or Maria Hill, depending on which era you're reading. That is defending the Earth and protecting Earth from other Earth-based threats. Whereas Sword, Sword and Shield, exists in space and protects the Earth against cosmic threats. Like if Doctor Doom's causing trouble in that area, Shield responds. If Galactus is heading toward Earth, Sword responds, to give you an idea of the kind of difference in their tactics. And so Sword, literally, I think right now they're orbit Earth in a space station. I think Captain Marvel actually ran them for a few years recently, so maybe they're working on that. But yeah, it's essentially Cosmic Shield. And if they used Nick Fury to introduce, characters all over the Marvel Universe, maybe we're going to use him and on his newly developed Sword station with his help of Skrulls, introduce the Eternals, or introduce more cosmic characters and bring in bigger fish to bring into this pond. I think this is actually a really good observation. I didn't even think about it because I was enjoying Nick Fury on vacation too much to consider that maybe he actually is developing, thinking bigger now. The Earth's safe. The Earth has enough heroes. Maybe space needs some more now too.
I think John's onto something here. Although I will say, in broad terms, is it smart for us to, create a sword when our shield isn't working well?
We're talking about the shield has Spider-Man now. It's totally fine.
Okay, our last email comes from James. He writes in, with Spider-Man Far From Home being so intertwined with the MCU, the big question for me that came to mind was, will Spider-Man Far From Home and Spider-Man Homecoming be on Disney Plus? Theoretically, you could watch all the films from the MCU on the upcoming Marvel Channel portion of the platform, but these two films are just distributed by Sony. So I'm curious what you guys say. Like, Chris, do you think the Disney Plus Marvel Channel is going to be missing the Spider-Man films?
I hadn't even thought of that, but that is a good question. I feel like they are going to be a part of it just because they are part of the MCU. But I really like Jacob said earlier, I'm dying for a book about this entire deal because there's so much we don't know about it and what the stipulations are. Like even that Richard Rushfield story, he says he got it from a good inside source, but we don't really know how accurate that even is. There's a chance there's some sort of discrepancy there too. So I'm really curious for someday in the future, should the planet survive a few more years, learning the full details of this deal.
I think there's a book to be made about the entire, rise of Marvel as a cinematic force. I mean, obviously those early years with Ike Perlmutter, it's just so much fascinating info that has not been reported on. And I know that book that you're quoted on, Chris, what is it? The Big Picture?
Big Picture, yeah, by Ben Fritz has a good little backstory on how Marvel sort of came to power.
Yeah, but it's just a chapter, but it's probably the best thing out there that puts that in perspective. I someday I hope there's a book on that, and I hope there's a book on Star Wars in the Disney age. I feel like there could be a insider behind the scenes book, a tell all, and all that too. Someone just needs to write this and get access. It's easy, right? Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's Slash Film Daily. You can find more of all of our work at slashfilm.com. You can find this podcast published every weekday on iTunes, Google, Overcast, Spotify, all the popular podcast apps. If you have a question, feedback, comments, concerns, we can read it in the mailbag. Send it to peter@slashfilm.com. And please leave your name and general geographic location in case we mention the email on the air. And please rate and review this podcast on iTunes. Tell your friends. Spread the word. And we'll see you tomorrow.